Why you suck at Total War? Reason number 2. You don't think about army composition. It's all well and good getting to know each unit and what they're capable of, but if you bring the wrong tools for the job, you're going to have a hard time. It's like trying to hammer a nail in with a screwdriver. You might be able to get the job done, but chances are you'll have a much easier and efficient time if you just use the frickin' hammer. So how do we know what units to bring to increase our chance of victory? Well, that all comes down to knowing the different factions' strengths and weaknesses. And then from that you can build your army to try and counter the enemy's strengths and exploit their weakness. For example, when facing the Dwarves or the Chaos, I know I'm going to need armor piercing because they're both heavily armoured factions. If I'm facing the Greenskins or the Skaven, I know they're factions that can field large armies, so I have to watch out for their numbers. Or if I'm facing the Wood Elves or the High Elves, I know there's a good chance I'm going to be at a ranged disadvantage. So get to know every faction's main strengths and weaknesses, and this will put you in good stead to bring the right tools for the job. And as you get to learn the different factions, you'll learn what to expect from them on the battlefield. Most armies can be broken down into 3 main parts: infantry, ranged, and large. How good is the enemy in these 3 areas? So the infantry, are they good? Are they bad? Are they heavily armoured like the Chaos? Could they come with tons of numbers like the Skaven? Ranged, do they have long range missiles? Is there likely to be a lot of them? Do they have artillery? Do they have no ranged units at all? How's the large section of their army? Do they have cavalry? Is it strong? Is it anti-large? Do they have no cavalry? Do they have monsters? Monstrous infantry? Single large monsters? Flying monsters? I could go on. There's millions of questions you could ask. You don't need to ask them all every time you face a different enemy though, because you will start to get to know the facts about each faction. And then once you know what you're up against, you can ask yourself the important question: how am I going to deal with that? I know what the enemy's strength is, but how am I going to prepare for it? By bringing the right units, of course, with intelligent army composition. Bretonnia has a lot of strong cavalry. How am I going to deal with that? They have weak infantry though. How can I exploit that? The Skaven can field lots of cheap infantry, so their army could be huge. How am I going to deal with that? The Vampires can't deal with large units very well, and they don't have any missiles. How can I take advantage of those things? These are all the kinds of questions you have to ask when facing any opponent and when using any different army. And then from that, you can decide how to build your army most effectively. However, you never really know what the enemy is going to throw at you. And in campaign, the AI could compose their army of pretty much anything, regardless of the army's strength or weakness. Of course, you can try and use spies to see what's in that army ahead of time, but even then it's not easy to switch out your units and change your army around to deal with a certain enemy. So you may need to prepare to go to war with a new faction by recruiting certain and different units into your army that are more capable of dealing with the new enemy's threat. As an example, I've got a techless campaign here. I've got a little high elf army, but it's all composed of spears and missiles, a fairly basic early high elves army. And let's say I'm planning to go to war with these dwarves here. I want to take their lands. But as we know, the dwarves have a ton of armor, so we're going to need something to deal with that. My spearmen and non-armor piercing missiles aren't going to be great at taking them on. So I'm recruiting a few units of white lions as their armor piercing, and also some cavalry, as those two things, armor piercing and cavalry, are weaknesses of the dwarves. So I can just put myself in a better position to take on the dwarves, as I have stuff that can deal with their army a lot better. And it's not as if you need to swap out your entire army to face a new enemy or anything, but giving yourself these little extra advantages by choosing the right units can make your war with a certain faction a lot easier. That brings us to the online competitive side of Total War, where things get really interesting. Many players in the online world use very traditional and conventional builds for the faction they're playing. For example, someone playing Bretonnia will probably bring a lot of cavalry because that's their strength. Someone playing the Lizardmen will bring a lot of large monsters because that's their strength. And while using a balanced and conventional army that plays to your faction's strengths can definitely work, it also makes you very predictable. And if you're predictable, the enemy is going to have an easy time choosing their army composition to best counter what you bring. So being unpredictable and unconventional is a very powerful tactic when facing human players. This can allow for some very creative and interesting builds with your army rather than just the traditional balanced builds you may bring. But both conventional and unconventional builds can work just as well as each other. The army composition of both sides is going to determine who has the advantages, and that just comes down to pure luck. Such is the nature of Total War, as we never know if the enemy is going to bring a conventional or unconventional army composition. Now maybe that was a little bit wordy and confusing, so allow me to give you some examples of what the hell I'm talking about. Online battle. I'm playing as the Beastmen, a faction known for its very strong monsters. My opponent, knowing this, has brought an army composition to combat those strong monsters, mostly anti-large units, which are Spearmen and some Lothan Sea Guard. Both units that will do very well against all the Chaos Spawn, Minotaurs, Giants, Razorgore Herd that the Beastmen could throw at you. There's also some Dragon Princes where he's poured a lot of his money hidden over in the trees here. Now me, knowing what he's expecting of me, I'm going to do the opposite of what he expects, and I've instead brought a ton of infantry, which are moving through the trees here to try and get a bit of a sneaky attack, and the only large units I have in my army is a couple of Centaurs back here. They're the only thing that his Spearmen are really designed for taking down properly. So I've completely forced a mismatch on him because I've got so much infantry. You can see I've got way more infantry than he has infantry, so he's very ill-equipped to deal with this many units. It's the volume of units that he's going to have the problems with, because I pretty much got 2 units to 1 of his, and there's 4 units to 1 of his here. But hopefully you get the idea. I was just trying to catch my opponent out by bringing something he didn't expect. Like I say, this is online and there's no way for him to know that I was going to do this. He simply had to take his best guess, and his best guess was a monster heavy Beastmen army. This battle also highlights the very different approaches to army composition. He was playing in a somewhat reactive way, knowing that the Beastmen have strong monsters. He built his army around trying to neutralize my strength. I didn't do that, however. Instead of trying to neutralize his strength, which would be his dragons or his cavalry maybe, I opted to create a weakness. As I know that the High Elves army is generally quite expensive and they can't field large armies, that's something I can do and create a mismatch with. This is starting to move into the idea of builds with specific game plans, which we'll cover in a later video. Another example of a build you wouldn't expect to see from a certain faction, a heavy defensive Skaven army. Lots of armor with storm vermin and artillery so we can be defensive. I've got some poison winds, I've got some rat ogres, and I can sit back and let the enemy come to me. Normally from the Skaven, you'd expect a lot of cheap units to be charging your way, but instead we've got only expensive units and we're going to play defensive. How about a Greenskins cavalry build? Oh yes, the Greenskins have a lot of cheap cavalry, meaning they can bring a hell of a lot of it, and that can be very difficult to deal with when overwhelming opponents. Cavalry isn't something you see a lot of from the Greenskins, it's mostly infantry with some monsters, so bringing a ton of cavalry is something people won't expect and they probably won't have seen before, and thus won't be able to deal with very well necessarily. So there's just a few ideas for some unconventional builds, but mostly I'm trying to demonstrate the power of unpredictability. It's not to say that traditional or conventional builds are bad, but surprise is a very powerful tactic. And for a last way to think about army composition, let's say I'm playing as the Greenskins and I'm facing off against the Empire. So what do we know about the Empire as an opponent? Well, their infantry isn't great. So our front line could simply be composed of Orc Boys. A very simple front line, but it'll do the job of taking on the Empire infantry. It's also very inexpensive, so I can put money elsewhere in my army. But how is that front line going to fare against the Lizardmen? If you answered, not very fucking well, you'd be correct. Orc Boys will not be able to stand up to the heavy armor of Saurus warriors, so that front line just won't do. We need something else. Black Orcs. Black Orcs are of course a great choice because they have a ton of armor piercing, they're very tough, they could take out many a Saurus warrior. But of course they are way more expensive, and thus our funds are going to be less to spend on the rest of our army. The price of your units is another thing to take into account for army composition, but we'll talk about this more in a later video. So we've got a Black Orc front line. It's very powerful, it's very dangerous, but it's important to realise that one army does not take all comers. You need to adjust. If the Black Orcs were facing the Wood Elves, they could have a very hard time and be done before they even get to the fight, because armor piercing missiles are a weakness for them. And the Wood Elves have a lot of those in their army, even some that could kite the Black Orcs so they'd never get near them and get absolutely hammered. So we need a different front line. We could go back to the Orc Boys. They have a shield that's going to help with those missiles, and we could bring more than the average amount of units, which will A, give them more units to shoot at, spreading out the damage to my front line, and give us a chance to overrun them, flank round, and get hold of those missile units with the Orc Boys. So hopefully you can see the need to adjust your units in your army to best fit what you're facing. Of course you never really know what you're facing, especially online, but this is part of the fun. This little concoction could be a legit front line. Night Goblins and Trolls. It'll be very unexpected and very unconventional. Savage Orc Biggins could also make a powerful front line. They got a ton of melee attack and they're anti-large, so good against those monster heavy factions. They do lack the armor of course, so it's always going to be risky, some of the builds you can come up with, but if you can catch your enemy out in an online situation, that could be very, very powerful. We'll get more into this stuff in a later builds video. So always try to make conscious and intelligent decisions about what units you take in your army. Everything should have a role and a purpose, and not just be there because it looks cool or because it's the most powerful unit. It needs to be there for a reason. You may have also noticed that there's a slightly contradictive nature to this entire topic. I've told you just to memorize all the strengths and weaknesses of the different factions, and then I told you not to worry about them because the enemy may not even bring that anyway. And while it's true that both the AI and human players may not play to their faction's strength anyway, it's still valuable information to know. Total War is really a game of knowledge. The more you know, the greater you can be.